All right, this question is for Dan McClellan.
All right, let's see it.
And Dan, I just want to thank you for heightening my own biblical literacy. At this point, I need to be paying you tuition.
Well, I could certainly use the money. I got a tiny problem with my airplane. See, the leather seats are starting to crack, kind of wear out a little bit there. A lot of cracking going on.
Is it true that the stories of Abraham and Moses were originally two separate, unconnected origin stories for the nation of Israel, that were then later stitched together to create one big unifying story?
Hey, thank you for a great question. This is absolutely a prominent theory within pentateuchal source criticism, but we've got to tweak it a little bit because it's actually not focused on Abraham. It's focused on Jacob. See, after we get through the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, we have 4 different patriarchal cycles of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And the longest, the most complex, and the most significant for the later history of Israel is actually the Jacob cycle. So many scholars think that this was the primary etiology for this ancestral land-based relationship between the nation of Israel and the patron deity of Israel, which was probably originally El. This is the central divine figure of Genesis. And in fact, when we look at all of the personal names throughout the book of Genesis, there's not a single one that has a Yahwistic theophoric element. In other words, nobody seemed to have named a child or a literary character after Adonai. The Tetragrammaton is not used in anybody's personal name, which suggests to some scholars that this originates in a tradition that did not know about Adonai. And Exodus 6:3 might confirm that if it's interpreted as the author suggesting that their versions of the patriarchal narratives, or at least the versions of the patriarchal narratives that they gave priority to, didn't mention Adonai. So this is probably an earlier independent tradition about the relationship between God and the people of Israel. And who's Israel? Well, that's Jacob. And then Moses seems to be a separate covenantal relationship that's based on liberation rather than on land directly. And here Adonai is the main deity, and so it's about the relationship between the people of Israel and Adonai. Now, this theory has gained prominence as the documentary hypothesis has been criticized. One of the main criticisms of the documentary hypothesis that has come up in the last few decades is the notion that J and E are not full documentary sources. In other words, they are not complete documentary sources that run from the stories of Genesis all the way through to the end of the Pentateuch. They are more fragmentary and they seem more isolated. And so once we get rid of J and E, then Genesis and Exodus are not automatically parts of all the documentary sources. And so maybe Genesis and Exodus are two originally distinct stories that were later brought together. So you have scholars like Conrad Schmidt in this wonderful, although very complex and technical book, talking about how these two texts were probably stitched together secondarily. But then you have folks like Joel Baden who are arguing against that and arguing in favor of a neo-documentary hypothesis. So this theory has become more prominent in recent years as support for the full documentary status of J and E has kind of waned among critical scholars, although the neo-documentary hypothesis is certainly trying to make the case for the maintenance of the view of J and E as full documentary sources. I tend to lean in the direction of rejecting J and E as full documentary sources, but that's not my area of specialization, and I don't know that we can speak about a consensus view anymore. It seems to me that the positions are more or less split about this, but I am still working on a large-scale state-of-the-field survey to send out to biblical scholars that will hopefully get us some data on where people stand on all of this. So stay tuned for more information about that.
Any help with this question is deeply appreciated, and the fit for this video is Matt Reeves' Batman.
Hey, thank you for a wonderful question. That's a great fit. I'm looking forward to the Batman #2, and the fit for my video has been the Spawn #1 cover.